Welcome to the Fly Culture Podcast, bringing you interviews, reviews and fishing tips. Here's your host, Pete Tigers.
Welcome back everyone to the Fly Culture Podcast. I hope you're managing to get out fishing and enjoying your time out on the water. I've been pretty lucky of late actually. It's been a real mixture of fishing really. When the rivers, we've been having a little bit of rain as many of you probably have as well. When we have some rain, I've been swinging flies for salmon, and when the river drops back down again, casting dry flies and sometimes the duo for trout as well. I've really enjoyed all of it. It's been really good fun. Hatches for the trout, there's still plenty of caddis around. There's midges around. I saw some yellow sallies today as well, which is a yellow stonefly. Even saw an odd mayfly as well, which they're still knocking round and they continue to sort of trickle off. Salmon fishing, not a great deal to report on that front. I was excited to catch my first salmon a little while back, a week, 2-3 weeks ago now. That was fantastic, and I'm trying that. I'm sticking to fishing spay flies as well, old school spay flies, and they're just so beautiful and they look fabulous in the water. So that's been really good. We're going to kick off the podcast today with a couple more questions. I've been sent some by listeners and readers of the magazine. This is the first one, and it says, "Thank you for the quality of these podcasts and your prodigious output. I'm going to give mullet fishing a go next year, even if I do live about as far away from a piece of coast as you can in Hertfordshire. My question is about tippet to dry fly connection and whether to grease, degrease or just leave it. I've always used Fuller's Earth. It's nice and traditional, but having read Peter Hayes' book, Fly Fishing Outside the Box and Trout Getting Closer, he recommends the tippet should float. At the end of the day, I do okay with the Fullers, but it's difficult to set up a situation where you can test each option. Anyway, the main purpose of this email is to let you know how much I enjoy the podcasts." That's from Reagan. Well, I think you've had some great advice from Pete Hayes. If you have listened to the podcast I did with him and Don Stasiger, that was a really interesting one and gave loads and loads of information. From a personal standpoint, and this is really just for the river that I fish, I don't do anything with my leader. So I will leave it. I don't like to degrease it. I haven't needed to be perfectly honest. And I never felt the need to grease it up to make it float as well. I know possibly at the back of it I could do that, but I've never needed to do that. So, and if it's a reason why fish are going to take or not take a fly, on my list of priorities, that's not at the utmost end of them. For me, I'm probably most concerned about drag and the drift of the fly as it comes down the pool. Does it look natural? Is there drag in there? The next thought might be, okay, if the fish hasn't taken, then is it micro drag? So they're the things that I start to think about first up. Then if the fish hasn't taken, if I've spent some time watching it, covered it the first time, nothing's happened, then I will start thinking about the drags I just mentioned. The next thing that I'll think about is pattern. I'll watch and wait a little bit longer. If the fish continues, if I'm lucky enough that it continues to rise, then I may think about changing the pattern. I may cast at it once more just to see if I've put enough slack in the cast. But the next thing that I'll do is think, right, do I need to downsize the size of my pattern a little bit? Or have I got the fly wrong? They're things that I start to think about next. Then I might start to think about tippet length and whether I need to lengthen that, make it a little bit finer. But generally, I don't tend to do those sorts of things. That's only on the rivers that I fish across the West Country. I'm heading up, though, interestingly, to fish the chalk streams this weekend. And that's going to be kind of interesting. So I'm going to, having you ask this question, Reagan, I'm going to think about this a little bit more and think, did I do anything? Should I do anything? And it'll be really interesting to see if those things come into play. But generally, personally speaking, I don't do anything with my leader at all. I let it do its thing. This next question says, "Hi Pete, listen to your latest podcast with Yeva this morning. Really good listen as always. I thought I'd take you up on your offer to ask questions, and at risk of being too political, I thought I'd stay on the diversity agenda that you started by talking about women in angling. There are, you said, some great ambassadors for women in fly fishing, but I struggle to think of black or other minority figures. Why do you think this is, and what can be done to address it? Is our sport racist? Very topical at the moment, and I've witnessed a lot of what I'd class as casual racism on social media. Fishing social media, always defended as being meant in jest, but equally damaging nonetheless. That's from Tom. Well, Tom, that's a really interesting question. First off, racism I can't tolerate in any form. I never have throughout my life, and I will continue not to. From an angling standpoint and bringing people from other backgrounds into fishing is an interesting one. And as a guide and instructor, over the years that I've been doing it, I've had people from just about every background that you can actually think of. Some people have gone on to love fly fishing as much as me, or almost as much as me. Some have just been passing through, really, and trying fly fishing out, seeing what it's like, and whether they might enjoy it or not. I think the best thing that we can do, really, though, is be positive about fly fishing, be friendly, and be welcoming. The community I happen to know, and I'm sure you're similar in fishing as a whole, is really friendly and wants to help people. And I think if it's seen and portrayed that way, in a positive way, then I think it will continue to encourage people into fishing, no matter the background. And as we talked about on the podcast, we are losing anglers, and we want to try and bring them in from every background that we possibly can, and make sure that they realise it isn't an elitist sport. It is for everyone, and the doors of fly fishing are open to everyone, no matter where they come from. I hope that answers your question. The podcast today, it's a pleasure to welcome Wayne Thomas. Wayne is from my neck of the woods in Devon. He's a writer, he's a journalist, and an all-round angler, really. The focus today will obviously centre more on his fly fishing, but we'll also hear about his book called I Caught a Glimpse. It features stories about fishing around North Devon and is a fascinating and really, really interesting read. So, Wayne, it's great to have you on the podcast. How's it going?
Fine, thank you, Pete. Good afternoon.
Good. And we were talking off mic, and you were out fishing last night on the Torridge. How was that?
Well, the conditions were virtually perfect, and it was beautiful to be on the river, but no luck again, which is a bit unfortunate because I've had quite a few sessions recently. Rivers looked absolutely perfect, drifted the fly across well-known lies, but there's been no salmon home, which has been the story recently, I'm afraid, despite perfect conditions.
It's a similar story, isn't it? And putting the rivers into context for our listeners, if they don't know, my home river, the Tor, and where Wayne was fishing last night, the Torridge, are pretty much brother and sister rivers. So they're very, very similar, and it's interesting hearing that similar sort of story, that there doesn't appear to be as many fish around at the moment. And I keep consistently waiting or hoping, probably hoping more than anything else, that a wave of fish might come through. But I guess the lack of the fish is something we just got to deal with right now, isn't it?
Yes, I'm sure it is, but you always fish on with hope. And Charles Innes, who fishes the river Torridge a lot, always said to me the best time to catch a salmon is when you've just caught one. And I think that's very true, because very often you get pods of fish coming through, and if you're in the right place at the right time, you may get really lucky and catch a couple.
That's been my hope, I must admit. And there was a day last year, back end on the Tour in September, and I just, funnily enough, recorded a podcast with Luke Bannister. And I took him down to the river, and the river was just starting to come up. And I don't know if you remember, Wayne, but then it became unfishable pretty much till the end of the season. And I was fishing down. I said, I've got to go for salmon. I've got to go. And there was one spot I know if fish are running up through, I know where they'll sit and have a rest. And I moved a pretty fast fly through the pool, had a grilse, and I kept getting whacked by fish. And sadly, Luke had to go, and I dropped him back. And then I thought, I've got to come back. This could be the moment. And sadly, the river became unfishable by the time I'd got back. But that was one of those moments where I felt something else could happen here. The fish, I guess they were getting excited that the river was starting to come up, and they were getting ready to run. But that was a fascinating one. And like you say, the river's been looking really good. I think certainly from a tour point of view, it's been holding its height really, really well. I was expecting it to come up and drop really quickly, but it seems to be holding pretty well at the moment. So it's encouraging. And like I said at the introduction, it's been nice to hear some people catching some fish as well. So fingers crossed there'll be one with my name on before too long. I don't mind. It'll be kind of nice. And like you say, putting those hours in just for that line to come to life is worth every second, isn't it?
Of course it is. You always fish on with hope, and there's far more to it than catching the salmon in a way, because as you said earlier, you've got the kingfishers. And have you seen any otters recently?
Not this year. Last year I did. I haven't seen one yet. So no, I haven't this year, but I tend to. They're relatively on the tour system. They're relatively, I do see them. And I took one gentleman out when I was guiding, actually. I took him on the mole in the morning. We saw an otter there. And I took him on the tour in the afternoon, and we saw an otter there as well. So I called him the otter magnet. And the really interesting thing about that, actually, was that fish continued. The otter was in the pool, and he said, well, there's no point fishing this anymore. And the fish continued to rise, and we actually caught some with the otter having swum right into the pool there and didn't seem to affect things too badly.
No, I'm always a little bit doubtful about people say you won't catch if there's an otter in the pool, but if fish were so sensitive to the otter, the otters would go hungry. When I was fishing in Ireland several years ago, a lot of my friends always said if you see a seal in the sea, you won't catch it or put the fish off. But in Ireland, they were saying the total opposite. They said, if you see seals there, it means there's fish there. And, that was undoubtedly true, because there was plenty of, when the week I was there wasn't many bass caught, but there was certainly plenty of bass to be caught there, and the seals don't put them off for very long.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's get this underway. I wanted to talk a little bit about where you're based. For me, it's, I guess, relative up the road, but if you could let our listeners know where you're based and a little bit about where you're fishing and what you're doing, if that would be cool to hear a little bit about.
Yeah, well, basically, I live in a little village just to the north of Barnstable, which is quite handy for both the coast and the rivers. And I was born in Martin, so I've always lived in North Devon. And I guess my first experiences with trout were in Martin. There's a little stream that runs down through the village called the River Humber. And my early days were basically with a worm and a hook, and I think I even caught them before I even had a rod with a little bit of fishing line. And over the years, I progressed to catching them initially it was all on bait, but then I suppose when I was in my early teens, I progressed to trying a little bit of fly fishing. Even tried a few little efforts at tying a few flies, and I can remember catching brownies in the river there. And looking back, the river there was only tiny. If you go back now and look at it, I think, well, was this river really so prolific? And you'll struggle to see a trout there now. In fact, I don't even know if the trout do reside in the river anymore, because there's been several quite bad pollutions there over the years. But I caught trout there to over a pound, which when you look at the size of the river, if you ever go down there, it's incredible to think how big they would grow. And they were beautiful fish, crimson spots, buttercup bellies, with real, perfection. But my earliest fishing was probably sea fishing. I used to go away with my family. We used to go down to Lewes in Cornwall. Used to float fish for garfish and mackerel off the Banjo Pier there. And never looked back, really. I can't remember a time when I haven't fished. So it's been
Yeah, that's really interesting. And coming back to your little stream, actually, the Umber.
Yeah.
And, Devon is known for the major rivers, but there's all these little streams and tributaries that are just quietly going about their business, often with trouting, not always, as you said, due to pollution or whatever those reasons for them not to be populated now. But it's, to me, even on a wider scale, those little streams, the not the big name places, have always been the really interesting ones to me. And it must have been fantastic ground to learn about fishing, not just fly fishing or trout, but working and thinking about fishing at an early age. And I guess there's not so much of that goes on in the same way, does it?
No, well, a lot of people who've read my book have related to the fact that I mentioned the little rivers. And a lot of people started off in their fishing careers fishing little trout streams or little pools. And sadly, a lot of the little streams and rivers, which were once prolific, don't actually have the fish in them. And we focus on the bigger rivers very often, the Tor, the Torridge, the Lynn. But the actual smaller rivers years ago, most of them had runs of sea trout. And I can remember seeing a fish in the Umber, which was undoubtedly a sea trout. And when I told my father that I'd seen this huge fish, no, you couldn't have seen that fish in that river. But talking to other people in the village, there were a run of sea trout which came up through the river, and there were fish of 5-6 pound caught in that river. And the river where I live now, the River Yeo at Loxall, years ago, used to have very prolific runs of salmon, and lots of the salmon used to run out of season. And unfortunately, there was quite a lot of poaching on the river. And if you talk to some of the old Barnstable people, you can hear some quite interesting tales about fish that were caught in the river. And there was fish over 30 pound caught in the Yeo. But sadly now, they're very few and far between. I mean, I did see a salmon dead on the banks 2 years ago, which had probably been ate by an otter. But they're not there in the numbers they were. And, some of the old timers, they said the fish were packed like sardines in some areas of the river. And even if you discount a little bit of exaggeration, there's been a huge decline in the last 30 years.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking to hear, isn't it? And it doesn't look set to turn around anytime soon, does it?
I don't think so. It's an extremely complex picture because it's difficult to put any one reason for it, because there's obviously climate change, and you've got, poaching's not a major issue now because the fish aren't there to poach. Pollution's obviously a major factor. Farming practices, potential pollutions from sewage works, and that have a huge impact. The siltation, but it's very difficult to find one reason. We were on holiday in Scotland a couple of years ago on the west coast, and I got chatting to the gardener at the estate where we were staying. We went on a fishing holiday, and I said to him, "What a beautiful river! I'm sure you get a fair run of salmon up through here." And he replied, "Well, yes, we used to, but we haven't seen any for 9 or 10 years." And he said within 10 years, he said they'll be extinct on this part of the coast. And that was pretty devastating. And his reason for that was undoubtedly the salmon farms, which are all along the coast there.
And that's going to be a problem, isn't it, with them being so well funded, and unless they change their practices. And it is, and I know on the podcast I did with Danny Morey, she said, the best way is to engage the wider public and make them aware of how that food source is not good for your health. And, we saw the programs, like I think it was Panorama had one on fish farms, which was excellent. And it had an impact, but people move on and they forget, don't they? And particularly, I hope with, I'm saying now it's a little way off, but Christmas time, that I wonder if there's a way to make, or coming into Christmas, a concerted effort to make people aware of this food source and how it's not good for them. And I wonder if that's something that we just need to keep fighting on every front, really, don't we? And you talked about pollution. Sewage treatment works have been a bugbear of mine that I've spoken to on here many times before. We've just got to continually be on this case, haven't we?
Yes, we have. And I think people, if they see any pollution, they really do need to call the Environment Agency, because a lot of people see things, they make comment, they grumble that nothing gets done. But if people don't actually report it, then nothing will get done. There's a lot of complacency out there. I'm not saying with anglers in general, but I think that there is complacency. People always leave it for somebody else or have a moan. But unless you actually pick up the phone and report it, nothing will happen.
Yeah. So let's move away from that a little bit. As I said to you, Wayne, off mic, that I do tend to go off all over the place, but let's take you back into your fishing timeline. And you said sort of sea fishing was, you were doing a bit of that as well. But the fly fishing, when that came through, where were you fishing when you picked up a fly rod? Was it still waters? Was it your River Humber? Was it whereabouts were you doing your fishing?
My first fly fishing would have been on the River Humber, which is only a tiny stream. And I can remember picking up a cheap fiberglass fly rod and going out and having a dabble. And I caught a few trout on the fly. But I was never a purist, never thought, oh, I must use a fly. But then I started to fish the local reservoirs, which of course were all fly only back then. And my first rainbow trout that I remember catching was at Whistling Pound Reservoir, and I can remember it quite clearly because my father dropped me off and came to collect me. I'd been there nearly all day, and I hadn't got a clue what I was doing. I remember casting out this sinking line and then it sank, and didn't really realise about imparting movement to the fly. And all of a sudden, the line pulled tight, and this rainbow trout leapt out of the water, and I can almost see it now leaping out in this. It was only a small fish, but a pound probably. But then they weren't stocked so large in those days, and you were quite happy if you caught your 2 or 3 rainbows for a pound. It was brilliant. It was before the days of stocking with big trout, and you were quite happy to go there. And then Whistling Pound, and back then progressed from Whistling Pound to Stafford Moor was a very popular stillwater fishery then, and used to fish there quite regular, and became quite adept at catching bags of trout. And then there was Blakewell, which opened up. So but I've always preferred sort of the bigger waters and the wilder aspects of fishing.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was going to ask you, somebody who had been catching, I guess, your traditional size Devon trout stream trout of 6 to 10, 12 inches to catching a pound rainbow. Was that a tipping point that you thought, and as a youngster, you were thinking, oh, actually, this is pretty cool? And is that what took you more so in that direction at that moment in time, that you thought, oh, actually, and I was that a direction that you were aware of and you thought, oh, these are pretty cool, I'm going to go chase these for a bit?
Don't really think it was a conscious effort. It's just the fact that I've always enjoyed catching fish, and it's sort of natural progression that you went from the small river to the reservoir, and then perhaps onto the still waters where you caught the much bigger trout. But I've always been one to think that the fish you catch are relative to the water you're fishing, and if you can catch probably the trout I caught of a pound in the River Humber, which is a tiny stream, is probably a far better fish than the 15-pound rainbow I caught at Blakewell. In relative terms, it all depends. You can only catch what's in the water you're fishing, and people also talk about still water fisheries, and they catch a trout of 2 pound and a couple of 2 pound. Oh, I've only caught a few stockies, but in a commercial still water, they're all stockies. A 15-pound fish you probably put in the day before. It's all relative. It's to where you're fishing.
Yeah. And were you visiting places like, because I kind of like the brown trout places, were you visiting places like Rodeford and Collerford when they opened and going to fish there and Fernworthy, the brown trout ones?
No, I haven't fished those. I did fish Rodeford last year, actually, with a friend of mine. We went perch fishing for the day with lures, which was quite interesting. And one of the comments I'll make there is we spent the day fishing with various lures for the trout. One of the perceptions that a lot of people have is that if you go out with lures and you're going to catch lots of trout, my experience has actually been the opposite. Fly fishing can be an extremely effective method of catching fish. We didn't catch any trout on lures at all. All we caught was perch. And yet you'd think if you cast out a Mepps and reined it in, you'd catch trout.
Mm.
But I would have been far more confident of catching trout if I'd gone there with a fly rod to catch trout. And just diversifying slightly. I fished on Chew Valley for the pike in the past, and I fished several of the trials with dead baits and lures in the traditional way of catching pike, and had some success. But my best days have been fishing for pike with a fly, and I've had multiple catches of fish to over £20 on a fly rod, and I've never emulated that success with bait or lures. So I think fly fishing, contrary to a lot of people's perception, is actually extremely effective.
That's interesting. One of the routes I wanted to go down as well with this is that you said, fly is a great way of catching multiple species. And, we're seeing a pike have been there in the background for as long as I can remember. And I know people were going to the North Devon coast and catching bass on a fly and latterly mullet for many, many years now. Do you think there is a crossover with methods like soft plastic fishing and fly fishing? And do you think that's a way to bring people into fly fishing a little bit as well via other routes that way?
Oh, undoubtedly, there's definitely a crossover with the methods, without a doubt. And many of the people who've started with fly fishing and do a lot of fly fishing also love using lures as well. Nick Hart loves his lure fishing for bass, and he does very well in the estuary with both the fly and the lure. I guess with fly fishing, there's a certain additional dimension with fly fishing, in as much as you've got the art of casting and the motions you go through, that is all part of it, rather than bait fishing where you're perhaps sitting and waiting more. With the fly fishing, the actual casting and going through those actions is all part of it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Do you think also as well, part of that, I hope it's not, and I'm doing everything I possibly can to break any of these down, but do you think fly fishing's still seen in a certain way by people who don't actually fly fish? And, I'm speaking as somebody who will turn up in jeans, t-shirt and a baseball cap. And I don't mind it's up to them how they want to do it. But do you think there is a perception about fly fishing in the UK that it's seen elitist, and that's a word I hate immensely, but do you think it's seen in a different way to the other forms of fishing?
I think it was, but I think those barriers are very quickly dropping. I can remember when I first started fly fishing on still waters, and you would go to Stafford Moor, and the majority of the anglers there were, to a degree, salmon fishermen who the river was out of salt, so they went fly fishing for trout. And there was a tendency for some of them to come across as a little bit more upper class, because you had this sort of class division more then. But I think that's largely gone now.
Do you think that social media has helped that immensely as well?
Yes, possibly. although I think the barriers started to drop long before social media. I mean, one of the things I've always liked about fishing is I can remember going back years ago to when I was fishing up at Stafford Moor, when it was that at the time I was young teenager, long hair, certainly wouldn't have fitted into the upper class sort of bracket. But I can remember sitting there and chatting to people who were fishing, who were undoubtedly doctors and lawyers. And we had that common interest, and we got an absolute like house on fire. You talked about the fish and the fishing, and in fishing, the barriers very quickly disappear.
Mm. Yeah, I think once you're inside it, you realise it, don't you? But, I always felt externally it was seen, and I've used it many times on this podcast, so apologies. But that sort of J.R. Hartley, genteel type person, and that's how I always worried fly fishing was seen by people who didn't fish as well. And yeah, that was always a worry of mine. I've tried really hard to say, look, it's everyone can do it. And as you say, once you're in it, you realise that, don't you? But it always worried me about that perception of how anglers were seen.
Yes, but the other thing as well is that years ago there was a huge difference in the generations as well. Whereas, and I mean, you could go anywhere now and someone could turn up to go fishing, and they may turn up in a jeans and t-shirt. It doesn't matter who they are, because people now tend to dress the same from wherever they come from. That's not just fishing, that's society as a whole.
Yeah, interesting. Let's come on to your work, and your work revolves around fishing as well. We're going to come on to the book a little bit later, but your journalistic work and the webpage you run and the other bits and pieces. Do you want to tell people a little bit about how you came into fishing? Was that something you really wanted to do, and the writing aspect of it was always the route you were going to go?
Well, I'm not a full-time writer and author. I have a day job, which I hope to leave sometime in the near future, because I've been working for the local water company for the last 40 years. So time has always been the challenge, is finding the time to do everything. And I've written the local angling column in the North Devon Journal for the last 20 years or so. And I started writing articles for fishing magazines back in the 80s. I had my first articles published, and they were in carp fishing magazines, a little bit of carp fishing. And then I did a few pike fishing articles and sea fishing articles. And it's expanded from that, really. I've written articles for many years, and eventually I've written the book as well. But prior to this book, I've had another book published back in 2004, which was a complete guide to fishing. And I had a phone call out of the blue. The publisher said, "We'd like you to write a book on fishing." And I said, "What sort of book?" And they said, "Well, the sort of book you could give to a grandson or something, to tell them how to start fishing." And I said, "Well, there's lots of that type of book about." They said, "Oh yes, but they're the sort of books that sell the best." So it wasn't really the book I wanted to write, but back at the time I was on different working patterns, so I had a bit more time, and I said, "Yeah, okay, I'll have a go." So it was 500 pages on all disciplines of angling, and I completed that one in about 6 months. Worked with a local photographer, and although it wasn't the book I wanted to write, I was quite pleased with the result, and I think it was quite well received. So, and in recent years, I've started my own website, which is North Devon Angling News, because I think the days of the printed local newspaper they're sort of fading away a little bit. So there was an opportunity to start writing about the local fishing. And I think there's a need for people to be able to find out what's happening locally. And with the demise of local papers, I think there's a danger that could go altogether.
Great. Let's come back to fishing. Where would you call your home water? Where right now is your home water? Where are you spending
Well, I
most of
would
your time
tend
fishing?
to say, as regards to the fly fishing aspect, it would have to be the Torridge, because I rent a beat there once a week. So when the conditions are right, I head for the Torridge. And I've been fishing the Torridge now for about 10 years. Um, the first season I fished, I didn't catch a salmon. I think the second season I lost one in April, and then I managed to catch one in September. And then for the next few years, I steadily managed to catch salmon pretty well every season. The last successful season I had was, I think, 4 years ago when I had 6. But for the last 3 years, I've blanked.
Yeah.
Pretty disheartening, really. But I don't think it's entirely a reflection upon my own ability, because if I could catch them, I'm still doing the same things. And I just think the fish aren't there in the numbers they were.
Yeah. And it's interesting, this ties with literature quite nicely, because there's some books on the Torridge, isn't there? Lemon Gray's book on the Torridge. And I know you wrote a review for me on the Torridge for the online magazine I used to run, Eat, Sleep, Fish, about the Torridge as well.
I think that was related to Charles's book.
Yes.
Which is Torridge Reflections, which is an excellent book. And it's not just about the fishing. A lot of Charles's book is about the people, because you obviously know Charles, but Charles spent many years at the Half Moon and is still very involved with the Half Moon Inn. That's a real traditional old fishing inn. And the stories that Charles tells of the people he met over the years and his experience on the river are a joy to read. I was very lucky to read the draft before it was published. So it's an excellent read. I would recommend it. And Lemon Gray's book as well. I mean, the big thing you notice if you read Lemon Gray's book is the numbers of salmon that used to be caught compared to now. It's a different world. And have you visited Little Warham?
Yes, I have, yeah.
I mean, they've got an old store there where they used to keep the salmon. But years ago, they would have a horse and cart go to the river to collect the salmon to bring back up to the house at the end of the day. I mean, it just paints a totally different picture.
It does seem to, and it's really interesting that you talk about the Half Moon as a fishing inn. And, I've got an old fishing guide from however many years ago, let's say 80, 90 years ago. And even along the Tor system, and I pass when I go fishing the Fortescue Arms and, all these fishing inns that were dotted along the river, and how they have sort of disappeared with the runs, I guess, in some respects, that they are no longer there. And we've got, the Arundel Arms, we've got the Fox and Hounds, the Half Moon, the Rising Sun. There's not so many in the system, and actually properly functioning as a fishing hotel, you can't do down here anymore, particularly if you're going for salmon. And I know when I started working with the Fox and Hounds, I got a bit of flack because people said, well, you're going for trout. But you couldn't rely on salmon and bringing salmon anglers down to stay at the hotel, to guide them, to teach them 7 days a week. You can't do that. You need the conditions. We didn't have the fish, but I could take people 7 days a week because the trout were there. And, I know the catch books that they have there. I've poured through those, and they were amazing. And it was fascinating seeing how it's a spring fishery and an autumn fishery as well. And we go through this debate, don't we, I'm sure it's the same on the Torridge. Well, there's not much of a spring run, or it's an autumn run, or perhaps there's more spring fish around now. And you could see, everyone would fish through till about the end of May, disappear, and then August, September, they'd be coming back again to fish again.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I think is sad over the years is people focus on the demise of the salmon. But one of the things that I think is vitally important is that whole community which used to revolve around the fishing for the salmon. And the hotels and inns were a very big part of that. And undoubtedly the same people would come back year in, year out to fish the rivers and would visit the inns. I can remember, oh, crikey, I'm probably going back 20 years or so now. I've visited the Tar Steps Hotel when they used to have fishing on the bar. And I can remember going into the bar to buy my permit for the day. And it had this real atmosphere of, you got the old leather sofa, and there was the old grandfather clock, and it was tick tock, tick tock. And it's like timeless. And then you could look through the old fishing records, and you go through and look at what was caught. And it had this sort of smell of stale cigars hanging in the air. And you could imagine that someone go out for the day, they'd had a day on the river, and they would come back and go back to the bar and enjoy a whiskey and a cigar. And there's this whole atmosphere. And I think we've lost an awful lot, because I used to fish on the River Lynn a lot. The Lynn was never a fly fishing river. But I went there just the other day, not fishing, just for a walk, and we'd had a good spate, and the river looked absolutely perfect. If that had been 30 years ago, the river would have been full of anglers, because when the conditions were right, there would be people who would jump in their car and drive down from London or wherever to fish, because it was a fantastic river. And you walk the river now, and there are still a few salmon being caught on the Lynn, but it's nothing like it was. The numbers of fish were phenomenal, and people would travel from miles around to fish it. And there was a real community, because those people would come in, year out. And you'd go down to the river, and you'd meet the same people, and you'd have a chat, and how are you getting on? And it's all gone. That whole community has gone. I went there, there wasn't a fisherman to be seen. It just died a death with the fishing.
Do you think that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy anyway, that if there aren't the fish, and funnily enough, you talked about perch fishing at Rowford, and I remember when the perch, how many years ago, were first being reported to be caught in there, and then everyone stopped fishing it for a bit, and it was always, you'd mention, let's say, Rowford, and people say, full of perch, and that was it. So people at the time weren't fishing there. And do you think it's similar in some respects with salmon, that people will want to go, this is probably not the right term, but where they've got a chance of catching a fish? And do you think that becomes self-fulfilling in that sense, that the runs are smaller, so the fishermen decline, so the catches become smaller as a result of that?
Yes, that's an extremely complex picture. And I think it's probably easier to look at the Tor and Torridge in many ways on that, because if you turn the clock back to the 70s and early 80s, you probably find that the vast majority of salmon, especially after a good spate, were caught on spinners. So particularly on parts of the upper Torridge, the spinning was very popular, especially in some of the pools, because some of the pools probably would be, the spinner would be more effective. So when spinning, quite rightly, was phased out to reduce the number of fish that were damaged or caught, a lot of those people who used to spin gave up fishing. So, of course, if you look at the catch returns from years ago, there was far more fish caught because the methods that were used were more effective. And there's whole stretches of the Tor where were very effective or very good pools for catching salmon on spinner, but they're not particularly good on the fly, because fly water and spinning water tend to be different. So to actually compare catches is very difficult.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've got a couple of thoughts on that, actually. And having looked through the Fox and Hounds catches, there was an anomaly between catches and when they phased out spinning. Was it in the 80s or something?
Yes, it was the early 80s.
Yeah, you could see when those catches went down as a result of that. And then sometimes I've seen it, and not all the time, and this is, I've seen sometimes people keener to throw metal than cast the fly, and that's fine if they've got a day. And I don't mean in Devon, I mean elsewhere. If you've got a day's fishing and you've paid for a day's fishing, you want what you feel is your best shot. But I wonder sometimes if that may be why the fly isn't as employed as much as it possibly can. Like you said, at home here, the tor and the torridge, using those as the examples, that I think, well, we only fish on the tor for the first month. So March you can spin, the rest of it you can't. I think the torridge is 0. So they're all fly caught fish, really, aren't they? And I don't think many people spin on the tor anyway. So it's kind of an interesting one to see, isn't it? And that impact on the catch numbers I didn't really think about in that sense as well, but that obviously played a significant role in that. And then perhaps that sort of drove fishermen away, perhaps.
Yes, and also there's also the debate that used to rage, and as fortunately, I mean, the whole catch and release debate, because years ago, people went fishing for salmon, they caught a salmon, they kept it, took it home. That was all part of it, and I speak to people on the Lyn who fish the Lyn, and one person I know in particular was totally against catch and release because he said that was just playing with the fish, and his belief was you went out, you caught a salmon, and you kept it, and it was a whole different ethos. And I believe Hugh Fulkus was very against catch and release as well because he didn't believe with the idea, but of course, the numbers of fish, but they were so much more prolific then that taking a few fish for the table didn't really matter. And relating to the Lyn, I do have minor concerns with the Lyn because the Lyn isn't a fly fishing river. It really is a river that lends itself to spinning and worming. And when I used to fish the Lyn on a regular basis, I would arrive on the river at 8 o'clock. Sometimes I'd be home by 9:30 with a brace of fish. But when I caught my 2 salmon, I packed up. Whereas with catch and release, you can get people go down there and catch perhaps half a dozen fish in a day. Now, I don't know what the mortality rate is with fish caught on spinner. That's the main reason I've declined from fishing the Lyn in recent years because of catch and release. I prefer to release salmon, but I took a friend of mine to the Lyn, must be about 10 years ago now, and he caught a salmon on a Meps. It took the spinner in, and it damaged the fish's gills. The fish was bleeding, and he held it in the water for 20 minutes. Eventually, he just let it go, and it just keeled over and died. And to see that fish floating off downstream really upset me, and which makes me very reluctant to go back to the Lyn and fish with the spinner or the worm, because I wouldn't like to see that happen. No. I think with a fly on the tor, the torridge, and rivers that are suited for it, the mortality rate is very low because the majority of fish, barbless hooks, they're easy to unhook and they go back without any problem.
Yeah, I've taken to fishing just singles now. That's it, and even on the tubes, I just put a single in. I don't fish. I'm not fished trebles. I can't even remember the last time that was. And it was doubles until about 2 years ago, 3 years ago, possibly longer than that now, actually. And I just fish singles, and that's fine by me.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to use doubles, but I've gone on to using barbless for the salmon. No real problem with that. I think the manufacturers of spinners and that could move a long way because actually there's not very many barbless single hook spinners available. They still tend to be the flying C's with the big trebles on the back, and I'm sure more effort could be made to actually sell more single hook barbless lures for where lure fishing is allowed on some of the bigger rivers or rivers like the Lyn.
Yeah, it's a good point. That is a good point. We've touched on the tor and the torridge, and I've spoken about my love for the tor many times on here. For our listeners, how would you describe the torridge to somebody who may have heard of it, may not have heard of it? How would you describe it to them, and what does it mean to you?
The torridge is a classic West Country salmon river, really. Runs down through very rural valleys, and you have old woodland, and lots of there's lots of farming down through the torridge. I think the biggest difference between the Tor and the Torridge, or one of the biggest differences, is that Torridge, throughout much of its length, is not near any roads. So it's a beautiful, peaceful river. And there's places there where you can fish and you don't hear a car or any sounds from the outside world. It's absolute, peace and quiet, which is beautiful. Where most of the Tor is flanked by the railway and the road. So you've always got that clatter of the train, which is sort of quite nice, or the buzz of traffic. And the other big difference between the two rivers as well, I would say, is the Tor, especially in its lower reaches, has got quite a lot of rock strata, and there's quite deep drop-offs. There's some quite deep pools in the Tor. And the Torridge is perhaps a little bit more friendly river to fish, because there's a lot more that you can wade. Got some lovely classic stretches for the fly, especially in the middle reaches.
Mm. And it's kind of interesting where it rises and where it actually enters and joins the Tor very briefly in the estuary. Isn't, as the crow flies, a very big distance, does it? It's almost like a horseshoe, really, isn't it?
Yes, the two rivers actually, the main sources of the two rivers are very close together, because the actual Tor starts up on Dartmoor, doesn't it, in the main part of the Tor at Tor Marsh. But of course, it's also fed from Exmoor with the Mole, the Bray, Little Dart on that side. But the actual sources of the river are probably within a mile of each other, because the Ochmont up on the Torridge is very close.
Mm.
And the other thing, we talk about rivers where they start, is the Torridge starts up near Hartland at Marston Mouth, and it flows down through, and it's very close to the sort of the Tamar. And you've got the Tamar that heads off down and joins us here at Plymouth on the south coast, and the Torridge, which joins up with the Tor on the North Devon coast. Fascinating journeys, the way that they travel, and yet the Torridge and the Tamar are quite similar rivers, I would say, geographically.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. Well, hopefully that's given people an insight into some of the Devon rivers. What I wanted to come on to next is your book. And as you alluded to, you've recently, or this year, have published it. It's called I Caught a Glimpse. And it chronicles fishing in and around North Devon. This, you said the book you had written previously wasn't really what you wanted to write. Is this the book you wanted to write?
Yes, very much so. It tells of my own fishing in North Devon, but more importantly, it chronicles the lives of other people fishing in North Devon, because over the years, obviously, you meet an awful lot of people fishing, and I was fascinated by the tales from the older generation who would tell me of the fish that used to be caught on the local rivers. Not just salmon and trout. There's a huge amount in there about salmon and trout, but one of the other fascinating things was that the River Tor was a very good coarse fishing river, and it was very prolific for its roach fishing in the lower reaches, certainly from Umberley down. And there was lots of roach caught there over £2, with fish caught of over £3. And back in the early 80s, those fish disappeared. So I think it's very important to try and make a record of what the rivers in North Devon, rivers and the sea, used to be like, because we tend to judge things on what we know ourselves. So we look at the fishing as it was perhaps when we were younger, and we see how it's changed to now. And that's our perception of fishing. What we don't tend to do is say, well, what was it like the generation before that? And on the Lynn, for example, there was individual anglers would regularly catch more than 100 salmon in a season. Now you're looking at a season when there's probably 30 or 40 salmon recorded for the entire river. And it's the same on the Tor and the Torridge. If you look back at what used to be caught even 50 years ago, and if you think on a wider scale than just my book, salmon must have been running the rivers for thousands of years or millions of years. And if you look at the decline in our lifetimes, of how the numbers have dropped, if the trend continues, the next generation that come along, salmon may be just a memory. So that was one of the reasons for just writing the book. One of the difficult things I found was it's relatively easy to sit down and write about your own experiences. What's quite difficult is to sit down with somebody and interview them over a period of an hour or a couple of hours. And then when I spoke to people, I recorded it. And then I'd come back a couple of days later and I'd sit there listening to the recording, making notes. To actually translate their passion and try and put that in words is very difficult, because you've got their words, but you've got your own way of saying things, and you've got to try and put that down on paper. And I found that quite a challenge.
And you said your first book you took 6 months to write. So given all of that work that you had to put in, it must be, and I know with the magazine where we edit that, and I think, again, I may have said it here, I may not have done, that we try not to heavily edit, because it's that person. I don't want what I want in the magazine. I want that person's article, not how I perceive that person's article should look. And that's really, really important to me. And I get where you are with that. And that must have been so much harder still to actually do that and make sure you did that justice. So how did that process work? Once you'd written that down, once you'd listened to it, once you'd written it, would you send that to the person that you'd interviewed for them to read, or how would that work?
Yes, every time I'd do the interview, I'd then write a transcript of that, and then I would let them read that through, and they would agree with that they liked it or they didn't like it. Generally speaking, they liked it, but there was one or two instances where they'd been a little bit too, perhaps, upfront and honest. So there was a couple of little bits that they wanted edited out. But apart from that, the people, I think, were very happy with what I did. One of the other things I found quite interesting was there was one gentleman I interviewed in the book who hadn't fished for many years because he was very elderly. He was in his 80s, and I went to his house and he had carers coming in, and he sat there and he started telling me about his time fishing on the River Tor, and started telling me tales about it. And then he related to the biggest salmon he'd caught on the river, and he was lying in his chair, and he suddenly sort of almost leapt up as if he got the fish on, and just to see that passion reenacted in somebody who would never fish again, but they almost believed they would because they still had that vivid memory. So memories are extremely important to people. You have a lifetime of fishing, and you'll always carry those memories.
And it sounds really interesting listening to this, that although it's North Devon centric, it really probably represents the forms of fishing countrywide, really, don't they? And the demise of the salmon, sea fishing, everything else. So it's not just sort of really Devon centric, I guess, is it?
No, it's got lichens to all over the country, I'm sure, worldwide, I'm sure, because wherever I seem to fish, if you start chatting, you always hear about how it used to be. And I've very often been to places, and you talk a few years later, and it's nothing like it was when you came here, wherever you go. So yeah, that's. I was going to say something then, and I've sort of lost my track of what I was going to say. Oh, I know what it was. It was about sea fishing. Off of Lynmouth, back in the turn of the century, not this century, the century before, going back Victorian times, they used to regularly catch common skate off of Lynmouth. And I've got a couple of photographs in the book. They actually caught common skate to over 200 pounds off the North Devon coast. And I mean, there's no record of common skate of any size being caught certainly in the last 50 years, although there was one caught a couple of years ago, but it was only a small one. But what's changed? I mean, it must be just commercial pressure, because everything else is the same. The food sources are still there, but these fish have just been wiped out.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking to hear, isn't it? And it seems to be man's intervention, doesn't it?
Yes, I mean, we've got a lot to answer for, because we just tend to destroy fisheries one after another. I mean, I look at when I was a youngster, we used to go down Renku Martin, and you'd see the mackerel shoals in the summer, and you'd look out over the calm sea in a summer's evening, and you'd see the shoals. You'd see them breaking water. You don't see that now. And I mean, the mackerel now are a thing of the mackerel are still there, but they're not there in the numbers. I can remember how prolific they were. Now you could go out for several trips and not catch a mackerel. In actual fact, I think it was a couple of years ago, the actual charter boats out of Ilfracombe, they actually stopped mackerel fishing for a while because the visitors weren't catching any mackerel, and they actually sort of stopped going out because there weren't any mackerel to catch. And that was a big part of the local tourist industry years ago.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking, isn't it? It is heartbreaking to hear. I did ask it. I went down again made the question a bit too long. How long did it actually take you to write the book in the end? Then having to interview everyone, edit, and write their responses. How long was that?
It's very difficult to put it into exactly how long, because the idea had been floating around for quite a time. I started writing the book in 2008, and I suppose I probably spent 4 or 5 years interviewing various people, and then it sat on the shelf for a short while until I found a publisher. And I sort of I parked it for a while, and then I thought I really must get a publisher. So then I started making a few inquiries, and fortunately, the little Egret Press liked it and published it.
Fantastic. It's interesting you talk about the gentleman who used to fish the Tor, and and that's how I imagine and hope when I can't fish any longer, that I don't keep journals, I don't keep diaries, I don't keep anything. I try and lock as much away as I can in my head, so that one day when I'm sitting in that chair, that I will remember that fish, I will remember that moment, I will remember. And it's even when I've been guiding over the years that I bump into people and I can't always remember their name, but I can remember the fish they caught, I can remember where they caught it, how we caught it, and stuff like that. And those memories are really important to have with us as well, aren't they?
They are extremely important. Years ago, I used to keep a regular journal of my fishing, and I've still got a few in the shed, and I sometimes pick them up and browse through them. But I've got out of the habit of keeping but I suppose writing the book and the website, to a degree, I'm doing that anyway. But I sort of regret it in a way that I don't. But it's all locked there in the mind. When you talk about people, one of the things I've always enjoyed with fishing is that over the years you meet an awful lot of people, you make a lot of friends, and sometimes you might go fishing with someone a couple of times, you become good friends with them, then you don't see them for perhaps 10 or 15 years, but you can just pick up the phone or just bump into them and you pick up where you left off, which is, I always think, a good thing about fishing.
Yeah, absolutely. The friendships you forge and the places that you go with those friends, like you say, doesn't have to be every week, but being able to pick up the phone and speak to them is really, really important. Are you pleased with how the book's come out?
Yes, very pleased.
How it turned out? Yep.
Yeah, I think I've had pretty positive feedback. The only thing I get occasionally is someone will buy it who's very much focused on sea angling, and they'll say, well, there's not enough sea angling in there. But because it reflects on the fishing that I've done, it tends to be a little bit of everything.
Yeah. And do you have any more plans with your writing? Have you got another book in you? Have you, are you planning anything else along those sorts of lines?
Well, I hope to expand and do a few more articles for magazines. I'll continue with my website and see how it goes. Whether I've got another book in me, I don't know, really. We've got a few ideas, but we'll see how it goes.
Cool. I love, if I'm lucky enough to catch a fish, I know I'm going to get a message from you pretty quickly afterwards to say, can I have the picture for your website? So it's always lovely to help in a small way. I'm just apologetic. I've been of little value to you this year so far, but hopefully that will change sometime soon. Where can people find your book if they want to buy it?
It's available from the Little Egret Press. You just look it up on the internet, you'll soon find it.
Lovely, fantastic. And just to remind everyone, that's called I Caught a Glimpse. Do you have a dream destination? Is there somewhere you would love to go fish that you haven't fished that you would love to do?
That's a very difficult question because there's so many places in the world to actually go fishing.
I'll tell you what, I'll give you 3.
I'd like to go to British Columbia and try and catch a sturgeon. And while I'm there, I'd probably like to catch some salmon. Bonefish. That's tempting to go and try and catch a bonefish. But as I said, there's so many things I'd like to do. I had a fascination for a short while. I'll never do it, but I loved reading about the Marcia in India. And I remember going to a talk by Paul Boot and Jeremy Wade years ago, before Jeremy became famous with his TV.
It was somewhere down the something river, wasn't it?
Yes, I've got the book somewhere down the Crazy River, and they did a talk about it, and I was fascinated by that. And I ended up, because the part of India that they were fishing was around the Jim Corbett National Park, and they talked quite a lot about Jim Corbett, who was very famous in as much that he used to shoot man-eating tigers. But he had an absolute love for wildlife and the tigers. And there's now a national park in his name, which is one of the last reserves of wild tiger. And I found that fascinating. It was sort of the whole history of it, and the Marcia and the wild river, and just being out there in the middle of nowhere fascinated me.
I think I had some guys write for Eat Sleep Fish about, they were in the Himalayas catching Marcia on fly, and some trout as well.
Yeah.
Which sounds, it's always been a dream of mine, that sort of Himalaya,
yes,
Bhutan, places like that, with the trout seeming to do incredibly well out there, and fishing these amazing places and reading about them first and foremost, really. But yeah, the sort of hidden places are still always somewhere where we seek out, isn't it? We always seem to.
I mean, fishing has taken me to some pretty splendid places. I mean, I've been to Norway twice sea fishing, and we went in July. And the difficulty there is you've got 24 hours of daylight, so it was very difficult to know when to actually stop. So we ended up, a couple of times we actually fished round the clock. It was, sort of fish round the clock, come back, have something to eat, go to bed, and within 3 or 4 hours you're up out again. Absolutely crazy. The time you fish like that for the week, when you come home, you wonder why for the next 3 weeks you're absolutely shattered, because of course it's the adrenaline that takes you through. And I went to Egypt fishing for Nile perch back in the late 90s, and I can remember the fishing was we had some good Nile perch. I had one off the bank, over 80 pound on a salmon spinning rod, which was pretty awesome. But I think what you remember is at that time Hale-Bopp, the comet, was going through, and I can remember being in the desert camping out, looking up and seeing Hale-Bopp go across the sky, and thinking that the last time that had actually passed by was when they were building the pyramids. There's this absolute timelessness about the landscapes that you visit. It's far more than just fishing.
Yeah, you're exactly right there. It is about not just that grip and grin or whatever it may be. It runs much deeper, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
Yeah. Wayne, it's been fantastic talking to you. We've chatted for over an hour now, and it's been really interesting and lovely to talk to somebody who fishes the Sister River and your passion for all forms of fishing. And I wish you the very best of luck, continued success with the book as well. And so, yeah, if our listeners are interested, Little Egret Press, you can find it on there, and the book's called I Caught a Glimpse. Thank you so much for being a guest on the Fly Culture podcast.
Thank you very much. Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Thanks, everyone, for listening to the Fly Culture podcast. I hope you enjoyed this one as much as I have. Thank you as well for the questions that you've been sending in. I'm really enjoying looking at those, and I've put a podcast together as well answering those, which I may have put out just before this one or just after. So apologies if we're a little bit confused on that one. Thank you for the kind comments about the podcast. I'm really, really pleased that you're enjoying those as much as I am. I just love sitting talking to people about fishing and their passion for fishing, and the magazine as well. I'm just absolutely bowled over with the support and goodwill that we've continued to have with that as well, and that you're enjoying the current issue. I'm really thrilled. You'll probably see that we've added, I'll do a little advertisement, that we've added some merchandise to the page now. So we've got some pint glasses, we've got whiskey tumblers, we've got cups to keep your coffee in, key rings, coasters. We tried to find slightly different things that we thought might be of interest to you. So if you haven't seen them already, please check those out. And thank you to everyone who has bought those as well so far. Thank you. I greatly appreciate it. So I hope you've enjoyed this one. Plenty more coming soon. Thanks very much indeed for listening.
The Fly Culture podcast is brought to you in association with Fly Culture, a quarterly print magazine. For more information, please visit flyculturemag.com. You can also find Fly Culture on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter.